Hello everyone, my name is Musonda Mumba and welcome to Planet Unplugged. I'm so excited to really be the moderator for this session, and I work for the United Nations Environment Programme. Welcome to all our member states and to UNEP. And piece of advice, we are recording. So we're being recorded and you guys look great. And all I want to say is that this recording is going to be shared. Please bear in mind that you can ask your questions, but we do not support anonymity. Tell us your name and would like to know who you are. And then we take the questions forward and to the presenters who are going to be here. And then, of course, lastly but not the least, I just want to say that we do have a technological challenge slightly because the whole world is online. 10 to 20 second lag time between presenter and also the panel. So just bear that in mind. So here we are to this topic of preventing the next pandemic and zoonotic diseases and how to break the chain of transmission. I really would love to really say thank you so much to the amazing presenters that we have. We have 1 hour with 4 distinguished speakers and also a moment to really reflect on what last Monday exactly was the World Zoonotic Day. What did that entail? That entailed that a report was released, and a fantastic report at that, and a brilliant collaboration between our agency, UNEP, and also ILRI, the International Livestock and Research Institute, based and headquartered out of here in Nairobi. Now, this report basically underlined 10 key messages, and you will hear all about that. But what was also very amazing was that it took about 11 authors, but not just 11 authors and not regular authors. It took 60 reviewers from around the world to review all of this maze and work and understanding of a lot of research, consolidate all of that within 3 months as a COVID-19 product, and present it in the 5 United Nations languages. It's just unbelievable. So, without further ado, I really would like to welcome Inga Andersen, who is our Executive Director at UN Environment. Welcome, Inga. And also to welcome the ILRI director as well, who is Jimmy Smith, Dr. Jimmy Smith, together with 2 technical experts, one from United Nations Environment Agency, who is Doreen Robinson, and also Professor Delia Grace Randolph. Thank you so much. At this juncture, I just want to pass on the baton to Inga to really tell us what the importance and the urgency of this report is. Inga, over to you.
Thank you, and welcome everyone, and let me invite everyone to kindly mute their microphones. And thank you very, very much for joining us this morning. As you heard from Musunda, yes, we're very proud partners with ILRI in preparing and releasing this report. And the first message and we launched it at the noon briefing in New York on the 6th of July with Jimmy Smith, who is the Director General of ILRI, at the noon briefing at the Secretariat in New York. And it is really important to understand some of these key messages. The first message is, look, COVID-19 might be a really bad zoonotic disease, but it's not the first. And we need to understand that about 60% of all infectious diseases are in fact zoonoses in nature. And we also need to understand that about 75% of new diseases have a zoonotic origin. And we all know about SARS and MERS and Rift Valley fever and H1N1 and Ebola and Zika, and I could go HIV/AIDS. I could go on and on. Diseases that started in the animal kingdom, if you like, often in the wild, amongst wild animal, and through some sort of intermediary species, a bat, a rat, what have you, mutated and came into the human population. We estimate that the direct cost of all of this is around, so far in the last 2 decades, is about $100 billion, and that does not include COVID-19. A second message that we want for all to understand is that there are many other zoonoses out there that really have been neglected, and because they are seen by the wealthier world as something that is in a faraway, distant corner and does not affect me. And those kind of diseases have really wrought havoc on many poorer populations. And so the awareness around zoonosis may be very high in some areas of Africa, say Ebola, where countries that have suffered from Ebola, and where actually the response architecture is quite strong. And we need to understand that about every year, 2 million people in low-income countries or middle-income countries die from some of these neglected zoonoses. So understanding these disease pathways and the pathogen pathways has become very important. Now, this new report speaks to these 7 drivers, the drivers that are making these zoonoses enter into the human population and understand them. And they are controversial and people will have views on them. But if we don't speak about the drivers, how can we then begin to understand? So the issue here is, how do we get zoonosis? We get it from being close to animals. How do we get close to animals? Well, there are a number of issues around this. And let me just start in no particular order, but as we have become wealthier, we've also endeavored to get more of our protein from animal protein. And that has made us strong and powerful, and it has been a function of wealth, which is a good thing. But today we see that about 1.6 billion people that we were on this good earth in 1900, we are 7.8 billion today. We've seen a 260% increase in meat production over the last 50 years, a 90% increase in milk, 340% increase in eggs, and all that I am not saying is not a good thing. It has meant that we got healthier and wealthier, but it has also meant that we got in more frequent interaction with animals, domesticated animals. And so that's the first point. An increasing demand for animal protein has seen a driver up of zoonosis. Secondly, the unsustainable agricultural intensification practices. IPBES speaks to this 100 million hectares of agricultural expansion that we've seen in the last, since 1980. Third, we've seen an increase in the use of and exploitation of and in the illegal trade of wildlife. And clearly there we get closer in touch with animals, both live and dead animals, and that has increased the risk. And obviously also the unsustainable practices that we have. We have eroded, denuded, cut down, fragmented ecosystems in such a way that ecosystems has been put under stress. There's interesting studies that show us that Zika tend to, where we have high diversity, you have lower Zika, where you have low diversity, you have higher Zika. Why is that? Well, when there's a natural balance of things, they tend to eradicate a big spread, a big breakout of a zoonotic disease such as Zika. More research is needed here, but if we begin to find that in fact higher biodiversity leads to lower level of zoonosis as a generic rule, that's a very powerful one. And a couple of other points. We've traveled more, so we've been more exposed to and taken these diseases with us. And obviously climate change. Well, as temperatures change, we have seen these species shifts where some species are in abundance because they react to moisture or heat, and others are in less, are more stressed because of these species shifts and these temperature shifts. And that can allow for that pathogen spread that I spoke of. And so all in all then, what we have seen is the destruction of the natural world being a common factor in the emergence of zoonosis. And investments and political will is not enough. And the big takeaway point that this report speaks to, yeah, you got to invest, and yes, you got to have political will, but there's this other thing, and Jimmy will speak about this, I'm sure. Dr. Jimmy Smith, who's the head and the Director General of ILRI, as I said, we come out with this idea that One Health, understanding planetary health, the health of our planet and its ecosystem, understanding veterinary health, and understanding human health, and carrying these together. And our friends in WHO, FAO, and OIE, the Animal Health Organization, this twin to WHO, but for animals, if I can say it that way, have worked on this for a long time, but we need to take it at the country level and take it at the regional and the global level. So with that, Lynn, let me just thank permanent representatives who are present, capitals who are dialing in, and of course, UNEP staff for participating. But most of all, let me thank Jimmy and this absolutely outstanding team at ILRI for having been such a strong partner in making us, helping us bring this this report to the fore. With that, I'll hand it back over to you, Musunda, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Inga. Really, really important of why this report matters. And for you colleagues who've not seen it or read it, please find time, 10 points on the key messages that are really absolutely fundamental and important. Without further ado, I just want to like to introduce Dr. Jimmy Smith, who is a Guyanese and Canadian national and also an expert in this work. And he happens to also be the Director General of ILRI, who are core partners on this report. Thank you so much for making time. I mean, just building on to what Inga has said, the importance of partnerships. Why does that matter in really crossing this chain of transmission?
Thank you, Ms. Inga. No sound.
Can you hear us now?
We can hear you now. Thank you.
Maybe there's a time lag there. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be joining you on the Planet Unplugged session today. There are lots of reasons why we're delighted to do this, because our partnership with UNEP is tremendously important for a number of reasons. Not only are we headquartered in the same city, but the mandates we're pursuing overlap considerably. And there's plenty of opportunities for developing this synergy, as this report shows. So we're delighted to have been involved in this report. And I would not reiterate what was already said in the report that Inga has gone over, but it does bring us to the point that there are things that need to change. COVID-19 is illustrating that the world as we know it now cannot persist into the future, or we would have many, many more such as COVID-19. It also points out that one of the places where such diseases get into human beings is through the food chain. And the role that agriculture, particularly animal agriculture, plays in this. Given that, as people have read this report, I've seen many comments about, well, if animals are at the forefront of this, why don't we get rid of the animals? Why don't we close all the wet markets? So let me come to the defense of the animals for a little bit, before I say what I really would like to say is how we de-risk the food chain in the longer term. Well, it may not be apparent to many, but there is a nuanced discussion which needs to be had. Those who are in North America, for example, or Europe, who consume somewhere between 80 and 120 kilograms of meat every year, perhaps arguably should eat a little less. But in many parts of the world, the consumption is tremendously low. Such the average consumption in Africa of meat is just 10 kilograms. So there are many places where we should eat a little bit more. And the reasons why we should eat a little bit more is because our nutritionists tell us that particularly in that first 1,000 days, the dietary needs for such young people cannot be easily met without animal source foods because of the particularly dense nutrients in such foods. So there is a compelling nutritional need, reason why we need the animals and the markets. The animals are also incredibly important for rural livelihoods. They are the saving banks for much of the rural poor, and they are a source of income for many of the world's poor, including the world's women. 70% of the food in the developing world comes from these wet markets or informal markets. Now, it's ironic that in the developing world, we look at them with some disparaging view. Yet, if you lived in North America or Europe, you fondly look at the farmers' markets. These wet markets are really farmers' markets in the making. So we should work not on getting rid of them, but certainly making them the delightful place we need to go as we do to farmers' markets elsewhere. It is also worth mentioning that animals are very much involved in a circular food system where we want to utilize all the outputs in the most effective way. 57% of the land used for feed production are not suitable for crops, for example. And 86% of the dry matter eaten by animals are not fit for human consumption. So by featuring in this circular market, animals are utilizing things which humans could not consume and converting them into these vitally important nutritious foods that I mentioned earlier. It is also true that where it's not the intensive or the crop livestock systems that I've just referred to, a third of the surface of the earth are rangelands. And there, when managed very effectively, animals play a very important role in making these rangelands carbon sinks and not emitters. So the case there for the animals. The question there is then, how do we de-risk these systems? How do we make them less threatening? And we discussed earlier, and you mentioned earlier, that one of the ways we need to de-risk these food systems is that we can work more harmoniously and synergistically in what we are referring to as the One Health systems, where veterinarians and people involved in livestock systems work very closely with people working in the environment and people working on human health. If we were able to work in this way and break down our institutional barriers, get rid of our disciplinary insularity and so on, we can certainly make our food systems much safer. We can make this small planet on which we live far more environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable. So that's the opportunity we see here to help de-risk what is at the heart of this. And one of the things we must do much better is to ensure that we can detect these diseases or predict them much sooner. The sooner we can detect these animals, these diseases, before they get into humans or spread around, the cheaper it is to control them. And therefore, this One Health system, which would help us to develop more effective surveillance systems, would certainly advance that cause. The bottom line here is that developing safe and sustainable food systems that work for all of us, including the many billions of people living in the global south, will require tremendous institutional, technological, and policy support. It will require ongoing collaboration, like the work we have started with UNEP. And it will require collaboration with others, such as FAO, WHO, and OIE. We stand ready at ILRI to continue this collaboration so that we make more COVIDs a thing of the past, rather than something we always have to be grappling with after it has happened. So thank you very much. We're delighted to be joining you, and we hope that this is just a start in a long, ongoing, fruitful collaboration with UNEP and the rest of the UN family. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for your intervention. Fantastic. So, you know, talking about this disciplinary secularities, I mean, breaking the cycle of not, getting ourselves stuck in our disciplines and all of that. And really, One Health is a demonstration of why it's important to work collaboratively. Thank you very much. Without further ado, I would love to introduce Professor Delia Randolph, who is an epidemiologist and a veterinarian, and who is someone who has extensive experience in these things called zoonoses, and a scientist at that who has published widely over 200 peer-reviewed, co-authored books, blogs, journal papers, etc. Professor Delia, you've been working extensively in this work. What do you see as the challenges? Here we are in a lockdown, in a pandemic world, the whole world stuck in this very complex space. What do you see as a challenge? And I understand you have some slides to share with us.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. It's delightful to be here and to be having this conversation. Can I ask my colleagues over on that side to start with the first slide? So this was the report which we launched, and I think you can see that this was a truly One Health report, unlike many of the other responses. Over on the right-hand side, you see the authors. The ones in green come from the ecology or environmental community, those in red from the medical community, and those in yellow from the veterinary community. And another nice thing about this joint production was that the environmental colleagues feature so strongly. I've been working in One Health and in eco-health for more than 2 decades, and one problem we've often noticed is that while it has been relatively easy to bring in the medical and veterinary experts and practitioners, there's always been more of a challenge in engaging the environment. So this was a great break with that tradition. Next slide. Next slide, please.
Hold on, I'm having a bit of a technical problem. It will come out in a second, hopefully.
Well, the next slide was just to commemorate the launch of this report, as we heard in New York, with some of the key remarks by the 2 directors who are involved in launching the report. After that, I wanted to quickly show how already so much impact this report is having. So the next slide contains a little summary of the number of readers, over 1 million, the television and radio companies who are already approaching so many of us, the op-eds which are being written, and some of the people who have been tweeting this report. David Navarro, really among the leaders in One Health. I then go on to say what is, in my mind, most unique about this report. Now, of course, COVID has completely disrupted the world. It has caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands, the illness of millions, trillions of dollars in economic loss. It's really changed the way we work and maybe the way we will work forever. But most of the world's response, and there has been a huge response from the different agencies, the governments, the intergovernmental organizations, the great majority of that response is focused on 2 things, perhaps for good reason. One is the actual medical response. How do we manage the hospitals, the ICUs, the diagnostics, the therapeutics, the vaccines? And the other area which has been focused on is building back better. How do we make food systems more resilient? How do we get value chains to work? How do we manage social protection programs? Now, we think this is great, but to use a medical analogy, and I'm a vet, I think we've gone all the way down now to slide 4. It is if you've got a patient who's sick in hospital and you're focusing all your resources on the symptoms and then on the rehabilitation, but you're not actually looking at the causes, what made them sick in the first place, and what can you do to stop that happening again. So this report focuses almost entirely on those 2 areas. The causes of pandemics, the drivers, and Inga has talked quite a bit about those, but also the drivers of the drivers, because unless we manage to address these drivers, we're just going to have continuing pandemics And actually, this pandemic has not been pretty, but as pandemics go, it's been far from the worst. In the past, when we've had diseases introduced to naive populations, for example, as happened when the New World opened up in the 16th century, as much as 95% of the population died. Smallpox killed regularly 30% of the population for thousands of years. So in some ways, this is a dry run of solving these underlying causes in order to prevent new diseases coming. Last slide. So as I said, while much of the report focused on the drivers, the rest of the report focused on the solutions. And here we have a solution. So another good news in the middle of all this chaos is that we have, again, 2 decades of evidence that by working together across the sectors, environment, animal health, human health, at this thing called One Health, we will find a way to build a safer world with fewer pandemics and less risk. But if we don't, if we miss this opportunity, then the next pandemic is just there over the horizon. Thank you for your attention. And apologies for the technology difficulties.
Thank you so much, Professor Randolph. I mean, I did warn people at the very beginning that we'll be having this lag, and it's really just as a result of having quite a lot of people online. And thank you so much for that insight. And the last slide, having the 3 boxes superimposed quite beautifully also around the issue of the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, the human health, environmental health, and animal health. How do we bring sort of these 3 elements together in balance? And we've seen that this imbalance has resulted into the challenges we're facing today. Without further ado, I'd like to move over to Doreen Robinson, who also happens to be a colleague within UN Environment, who heads our wildlife team here in the agency and has extensive experience as well of having worked in Southern Africa, Madagascar, different places in the Congo, looking at the intersectionality of environment, conservation, rural development, biodiversity, and also food security. Doreen, without further ado, you've really been working around the element of zoonosis and also the issues of conservation interactions with people. How can we break this chain of transmission? I think people would like to know going forward.
Great. So I have the pleasure of going last, which means I get to sum up some really pithy messages. First and foremost, I think what you've heard today and what our report shows is that there's so much that we do know about zoonotic diseases, but there's also a lot that we don't know about zoonotic diseases. So the first part of breaking the chain is we've got to invest more in understanding those integrated linkages between human, animal, and the environment. And other speakers have, of course, alluded to this. The other second part of it is we need to do a much better job of understanding and mitigating risks and having our policies and responses be evidence-based and tied to those risks. So we heard a lot about the root causes, and then we even heard about the root causes. So I won't reference those again, but it is important that if we don't continue to work along those root causes and root causes, we're never going to solve the problem. The good news is, we've heard that human behavior drives the emergence and transmission of zoonotic disease. That means that human behavior can fix it. So that's where we need to start. The second set of findings in our report that indicate what to do, again, we've talked a bit about it, is that we need to improve, we need to really think about how we produce, consume, and transport food, and also how we address food security. Jimmy talked about traditional food markets and the importance of ramping up safety and hygiene in these markets, but clearly there are zoonotic risks associated with the consumption and movement of both wild and domesticated meat all along the value chain, from source to your kitchen. However, the best responses need to be based on the wider body of evidence that relates complex social, economic, and epidemiological connections, and they have to be tailored to those risks. Knee-jerk reactions don't help. So improved sanitary measures and safety all along the chain will help. The third point I want to make from our report is that the evidence we gather says that we need to do a much better job of understanding risks, particularly the environment dimensions. We know that forest fragmentation does influence the emergence and transmission of zoonotic disease. We know that climate change and its impacts, particularly through rainfall, temperature, also influences in very complex ways the emergence and transmission of zoonotic diseases. So these dimensions, which are in many cases the least looked at, the least understood, the weakest link in the One Health approach, we need to invest more in understanding them. And to invest more, there's two areas I want to highlight that haven't been touched upon. First, we need to increase our investment in multidisciplinary science. We've concluded that scientific inquiry can't just stick within sectors, but it has to look across, again, the different sectors, but also look at social, economic, and environmental dimensions of One Health. We need to improve cost-benefit analysis of emerging disease prevention. This means we need to include full cost accounting of societal impacts of disease. I think this pandemic has showed us that the impacts of zoonotic disease go well beyond public health impacts. And so we need a systemic way to be able to analyze that, because I think when we know, once we do, it will become very clear the investment in prevention is worth it. And then lastly, I'll just summarize, of course, on understanding the environmental dimensions. We need to do more, but we need to do that at different scales. We need to work at the international, the national, all the way down to the local level, where there's lots of community-based and indigenous science and knowledge about zoonotic diseases that we can tap into in our One Health approach. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Doreen, for really sort of summing all of that up and just sharing your experiences and the actual importance of multidisciplinary science. Colleagues, member states, please do not forget to share your questions. We're seeing some questions popping in already, and I will start asking this question. So just very quickly, really summing up sort of very quickly in a minute, it's great to hear the chapeau from a multilateral organization like UNEP, what Inga talked about, the real importance of conversation and dialogues, but also seeing these partnerships as Dr. Jimmy Smith put that together, really important to come together and work together, which we've just seen. And Professor Delia really just talked about the danger, the dangerous zone that we're in. How do we look at all these interactions, our interactions with animals, interactions within our landscapes, etc., but also the importance of this, moving away from insularity, as you've rightly put it, Doreen, multidisciplinary science, looking at all the different scales, what's happening in our very own kitchens. So without further ado, I just want to ask a question to Inga very quickly. People are very curious in terms of how we're moving forward in preparations for UNEA. It's an unprecedented time. So here we are preparing for UNEA. How can we take advantage of the conversations that are happening now in looking forward and presenting the right message at the UN Environment Assembly next year in February?
Well, I think, first of all, we want UNEP to remain that broad organization that deals with a number of issues. We deal with climate change, we deal with nature and ecosystems and biodiversity, and we deal with pollution, waste and chemicals, and we're not going to stop that. So clearly our broad agenda needs to be held onto. But we will be coming into a UNEA on the let's hope the ending, but anyhow in the midst or on the back of something extraordinary that in January of this year no one would have predicted or envisaged, although a number of UNEP reports and ILRI reports have spoken to this for quite some time. But we will be coming on the heels of this or in the middle of a pandemic. And therefore, clearly we want to focus on the issues in the nature block, if you like. We want to really have a clear understanding that an ambitious biodiversity agreement, an agreement that deals with some of these underlying currents, that addresses the issues of fragmentation, deforestation, etc., that agenda is well understood and well internalized. Because I hope that people will see that this is no longer a sort of nice to have biodiversity thing. This is absolutely critical for people, for poverty reduction, for prosperity, for equity, and for planetary security. So what we want is for us to say, look, we are not just sort of taking care of nature as a last add-on for once we've gotten ourselves wealthy. We've seen that millions of people are falling into poverty because of COVID. We're seeing that we are losing gains that we've made because of COVID. And when we listen to Dr. Delia and we listen to Doreen and Dr. Jimmy Smith, and we understand that what in fact has happened here is that we've gone sectoral. We've had the health people doing great stuff, we've had the veterinary people doing great stuff, and we've had the ecosystem people doing great stuff, but that's not good enough. And I think Dr. Delia's Venn diagram is precisely what we need to hold up, because we are not the health people, nor are we the veterinary people, but that's where partnerships come in. So that's in the, if you like, the nature piece that we need to maintain and keep that ambition for COP15. But we also need to understand that the CITES Convention that deals with both legal, leave that aside, and illegal, don't leave that aside, trade, that countries have signed up to this, and therefore that we need to adhere to what we've signed up to and address that as well. So the UN conventions become ever more important in this regard. Back over to you, Musunda.
Thank you so very much. The power of multilateralism and why we should not forget why that is important. Dr. Smith, I turn to you because there's a question for you from a colleague, Abdelkader, who is asking, should pastoralists be exempted from lockdown? Because we've seen that the pastoral economy is mobile, very vulnerable, and such conditions and high impact on livelihood, so minimizing grazing competition and protection of pasture from being overgrazed. So with lockdown, there's no milk, there's no meat, and no markets for local transport. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think there's a blanket answer to that. It depends on where you're starting from, of course. Pastoralists can continue to operate if they take the same measures that everyone else will take. If there is a case that's isolated and there is tracing and so on and so on. So I would say that we adapt the measures we know that work to the pastoral system that we cannot lock down. Pastoralists are in the dry lands, they cannot stay in one place. The cure would be worse than the disease itself. So I would say that we could apply the measures we know in pastoral systems in much the same way as we do. Now there is a challenge, of course, because they tend to be more remote, and so testing is difficult and so on and so on. And so there may be greater education that needs to be had and on how you detect early and how you take extra provisions to isolate early, precautionary, and so on and so on. So a question I hadn't thought about before, but that would be my sort of quick reaction to it. I don't know if you'd allow my colleague Delia, I see her shaking her head. Maybe she has some responses to this as well.
Absolutely. Over to you, Delia. Any thoughts on that?
Well, just to agree, but also to say that, like in Europe, farmers have not been locked down. They're still allowed to go to the fields and work and look after their sheep. I come from Ireland, where we are also a largely pastoral economy. And in some ways, they are safer. You know, some of the most dangerous places have been institutions, old folks' homes, prisons, meat packing plants. So people who are out and about in the sun, moving constantly, I don't think they're the people we need to worry about most even. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that example from Ireland. And I think your point to Dr. Smith, to education, early detection, I think is really, really critical and something I've seen sort of emerging on the wires fairly recently. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Doreen, people are very curious. I've seen sort of lumping this question just in the interest of time. People are very curious. What should countries do in really to just reduce the potential risk of another pandemic?
Thanks. So again, I think we've touched on a lot of these. First and foremost, it sounds like I'm beating a drum, but we need to start putting One Health approaches in place on the ground. We have to go beyond talking about them and actually operationalize them, which means getting these different sectoral groups talking together in the national teams and having them work at those different scales that I talked about. We talked about investing in surveillance, but I think there's a lot we can learn about things we've done with One Health Right. So there's a number of cases, particularly in Africa, but also in Latin America, Asia, where community and public health workers are working very well with environmental monitors on the ground. And they're doing joint surveillance, some from the public health side, some from the wildlife side, and sharing that information in good ways on a regular basis so that they can detect the emergence of disease before it even becomes an outbreak or an epidemic, let alone a pandemic. And that is the importance of working on that on the ground scale across these sectors. And then the last one, which does lead us into your UNEA question, which is we have to build back better. What a horrible tragedy we've seen in the past year of 2020, but what an opportunity to get it right. The pathway we're on is clearly not sustainable. So we know the pathways to get to sustainability, but we can't forsake, in the spirits of expediency and turning on jobs and turning on economies, we cannot backtrack on the environmental safeguards that we already have in place. As a matter of fact, we need to ratchet them up even more because we know environmental drivers are causing or are exacerbating pandemics. So I think we lost, the super year of 2020 to some degree, but it's just been put off until 2021. And so the importance of paying attention and countries really getting involved and making sure that we have those ambitious commitments to the climate COP, to the biodiversity COP, if we want to prevent the next pandemic. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Doreen. I think just nature put itself in the center and showed us why it's important. And I think it still remains a super year in a very ironic way of, sort of an ironic way of doing things. Delia, there's a question from Paul Miner, and building a little bit about what Doreen has just mentioned, he's curious. He says, One Health hasn't quite worked. What are we missing? How can we convince the world that this is the way to go?
Thank you. I think it has worked and it hasn't worked. I think it has worked in many ways, but it hasn't met its full potential. I mean, we've seen at the highest level something called the tripartite agreement with international government agencies coming together and fully endorsing One Health. We've seen the World Bank operationalizing One Health in all its programs. In many countries, including Kenya, we've seen very successful intergovernmental and civil society initiatives. Here we have what's called the Zoonotic disease unit. It was one of the first in the world, and it's considered to be one of the better. But certainly the full potential has not been reached, and I think that potential will not happen until there is more commitment and more investment by people like the finance ministries that we actually need to sort of work together on the ground, not just at national level and international level, but hasn't been mentioned. And there's plenty of successful examples. The issue is they are islands of success. So how do we grow those islands until it becomes the way we do business? Those are my ideas. Thanks.
Thank you very much. How do we bring those islands together and stop them, working in isolation? And I think this goes very quickly to a question, perhaps for Inga, coming from Nancy Groves, who's wondering, great that UNEP has taken a lead on this report. It's fantastic. But then how can we better bring on WHO, FAO, UNDP, UNESCO, and others to work on issues of zoonosis?
Thank you. No, I mean, I think one could sort of say, look, it's really good that the three agencies, FAO, WHO, and OIE, signed an agreement on One Health. But there was a dimension missing. They didn't actually have the natural world. And this was done in 2014 or some such time. And I don't know the historic of that. But one thing I can tell you is that we absolutely determined, my colleagues in these agencies that I just mentioned, to step up and certainly bring in the strength of the environment dimension, which is what UNEP is here for. That doesn't mean to the exclusion of others. Obviously, UNDP has boots on the ground and so on and so forth. But I think, and UNESCO, as you referenced in the question, has the scientific commissions. So there are dimensions of relevance across the UN system, but I would say the immediacies. Clearly, we have the CGIAR centers where ILRI forms one, but we should consider a broadening of that, because we need to talk about how we have expansive agriculture, which we understand is problematic, and that's not an ILRI thing. It is obviously other centers thing, and we have the great centers that deal with forestry that also have location both in Indonesia and in Kenya. So at any rate, so we need to talk about the CGIAR community, the scientific agricultural research community, but we also need to talk about the UN agencies. And there, the primary, I'd like to say 4, OIE not being a UN agency, by the way, WHO, FAO, UNEP, and OIE. I think these are key partners for us to move this forward. And in my discussions with both Dr. Xu from FAO, as well as in our engagement with WHO and IOE, it's clear that that has to be part of the forward-moving pattern. But frankly, we need to think about this as, who said that? One of the brilliant speakers before me, maybe it was Doreen or Delia, at the global level, at the regional level, at the country level, and at the community level. And that means that that health clinic needs to have an understanding of and a connection with the veterinary community. And they need in turn to have an understanding and a connection with the natural resources community. And that's not there to the extent that we would like it to be, although in some areas there are some good examples, and Dr. Delia mentioned one or two such examples. But we need to step that up and step that up in a much better way. But it starts at home. And so it starts with us. What can we do? And we need to reach out to our friends in the UN system to ensure that that we become part of that already established community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inga. Indeed, I mean, to realize that there was work happening in 2014, but very fragmented. And so here's a pandemic that's brought us together now. That's just incredibly amazing. Thank you so much for those thoughts. Doreen, there's a question that's coming from Michelle, really wondering, you know, we were supposed to have Kunming, we were all getting ready and charged with the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So how do you see the whole issue of, I mean, especially this report in relation to pushing out some of the things that should really be raised towards this framework? How do we see that being reinforced?
Great. Yeah, so if you go back to the seven deadly drivers of zoonotic disease, you'll see a really strong overlap with the drivers in general of biodiversity loss and environmental degradation. So we know some of the ways forward, but we also know that the level of ambition and the level of accountability in these global frameworks hasn't been where we need it to be. It certainly wasn't in the past, in the ACHI targets and some of the past frameworks. And so I think we cannot step back. We have to keep up our pressure to make sure that that ambition, that accountability, and that those means of measuring progress come out on the other side of it, whether it's in 2020 or 2021. I also think, you know, it's important to know that the work is still going on behind the scenes, be it to make these COPs a success. The SBSTA and SBI are coming up, and there's different opportunities for input now. So even though we are kind of in a global focus on these short-term, immediate emergency agendas, that's human nature, we can't lose sight of this long-term commitment.
Thank you very much, Doreen, for that. Let's not lose sight of that very long-term commitment that's coming really ahead of us, and a moment or an opportunity for us to do better. Dr. Smith, a last question to you. Thoughts about the food system. So in terms of, you know, the big recommendation from this report is the de-risking of food systems. You know, how do we then prepare ourselves in going forward and how we look at our food systems differently?
That's a very big topic that embraces almost everything we started to talk about. Before I make a comment or two on that. Let me just double back to the last discussion we had a little bit. The need for investment, the need for One Health. We knew all these things before, and we haven't done them. But I'm hopeful this time, as with the Black Lives Matter movement, it takes a trigger to make something to happen. And I hope that this pandemic would be the trigger to really make us work together on this. And a good bit of it is disciplinary and institutional insularity. We don't want to work with each other. We want to protect our little mandate and preserve it and so on. So as I say, the fish rots from the head. If we as institutions internalize this as heads of institutions and make this work for us, we can make a great leap forward this time. So preserving our food systems take into consideration all those things that you have been just talking about, Inger and Lynn. It is about looking at the issue of fragmentation, for example, looking at biodiversity, looking at how not just about food, but how foods relate to the environment and all this. So it's a very big topic that defies a one-off answer to the whole issue. But I think as we sit and look at what needs to be done, not only with respect to the preventing pandemics, but ensuring by 2050, we'd have 2.5 billion more people or so to be fed. We need 50 to 70% more food than we consume now. How are we going to get that? How are we going to meet those needs? This needs a very careful look so that we can meet those needs, but we can meet them in an environmentally, socially equitable, sustainable way. So this conversation about how we meet and discuss and find common ground, I think, is probably one of the most important places to start. Because if we launch out and continue on our, what I like to call disciplinary and institutional insularity, then we will have more of the same, and the more of the same is not sustainable.
Thank you so much indeed for that. Delia, last one, final question from Alan Lele, who's wondering, what do you think the next 50 years looks like if we don't really implement One Health?
Well, we have a good idea what it will look like, because the past is the best guide to the future. And we've been now mapping and monitoring these emerging infectious diseases. We've got pretty good data from the 1930s. What we're seeing is every 4 to 8 months, a new disease is emerging. Most of these are coming from wildlife, 75%. Many of the worst use domestic animals as a bridge, as a way of moving from the wild systems into humans, which is why it's so important, something we call biosecurity, which means preventing these jumps, these spillovers. And yes, I mean, these are what we call predictably unpredictable. We can't say the next pandemic will come from camels. We never thought MERS would come from camels. Everybody was looking at the chickens and the pigs. This latest COVID, it's not completely clear, but definitely bats are possibly involved. So we can't say where, we can't say when, but we can say yes. In the next 50 years, we're going to see more pandemics. And as I said, some of them may make COVID-19 look like a very minor problem indeed. Thank you. On that slightly depressing note, but it's also an opportunity to do something. When we have a crisis we can still cope with, before we get the crisis we can't cope with.
Thank you so much for that, Delia. On that note, I just really want to ask Inga on her thoughts and looking forward with hope and what we can do differently as a collective, as humanity.
Well, I think what we can do differently is what we've begun to do here. We've reached out to our friends at ILRI, or they reached out to us. It doesn't matter how it started. We held hands and we said, look, we have the ability to put out something very fast that will be science-based, but will also reach a broad audience. That's what we've done. And as my good colleague and ex-colleague and good friend Jimmy has said, indeed, this is about finding that broad partnerships, and it is about showing leadership that he and I and others can do, so that we say that we get that this is not about an individual organization shouting from the rooftops that they have a mighty nice report, etc. It is about understanding the complexity of the science needs complexity of scientists from a variety of disciplines and from us pushing forward. And we, with ILRI and many other partners, very much look forward to doing that. We understand that the world now knows, as Delia said, the world now knows what a pandemic looks like. We hadn't seen one in our living generation. And so seeing this and understanding that this virus is not so efficient, it's efficient in spreading, but in terms of the number of mortalities, but there are others out there that are much more efficient in mortality. That has been understood now, which means that there is an understanding that we need to step up. So today we're stepping up and we are showing that, in fact, the One Health approach is one of the many important solutions that we have to take forward. Thank you very much to our friends at ILRI, as well as to Doreen and to you, Musunda. I hand it back over to you to do a close.
Oh, thank you so very much on that really wonderful and positive note. Colleagues, this is all we've had time for. To the member states who logged in, thank you very much for finding time to listen to this discussion. I really would like to thank you, Inga. I'd like to thank you, Jimmy and Delia, and also Doreen. But I also want to thank my colleagues who are really behind the scenes to make, everyone look great. Carlotta, to Ray, to so many others. Martin, Sophia, Alan, you guys have been just amazing to make this possible. Even in Nairobi, where the internet has been very glitchy, I did not drop off, thankfully. To Nandita for making sure everything works. Thank you very much. I really want to thank you. And if you have not downloaded the report, there's a link right there in the questions section. Please download that report. It's been shared over 6,000 times, plus, and counting. Share it widely. Let people know that we have to step forward and go forward and be the change we have to be. Thank you, everyone, and wishing you a safe and beautiful rest of the week. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. You can just sign off.